Alrighty. It's kind of ridiculous, but all the same, fine. Can't tell whether I'm in focus or not. Let's try fooling with this. And it's about as good as we're going to get. Hey folks. Don't mind me, today is more troublesome than usual. Let me see, I got my coffee. I assume I have audio. Yep. Let's see. I have to learn how to use Twitch properly. I don't know how to do that yet, so that's going to be a problem. But seeing as Twitch is not the only thing we're doing, and how it's mostly about the YouTubes, let us down some of this stuff. Hey, PipFap made it over to Twitter. And over to the Facebooks. I'll post that on the Airwindows. And just for laughs, let's jump on Modular Mayhem, because this is a stream. In fact, this is like 2 hours worth of stream. Well, an hour and 42 minutes worth of stream. A and Q, that's right. That's Q add A. What am I doing? Oh no. Alrighty, so that's got that posted to Colin's stream thing. I'll be back there when I can. And folks are showing up. I have my whiteboard marker. I have my magic paw of eraser, as I can demonstrate here. See, it's a cartoon paw, so it has 3 fingers. And coffee. And my chat, which is a chat on what I can see, and what I'm restreaming here is YouTube. I can see the Twitch chat, and my whole setup is set up to stream to Twitch as well, since mostly I'm doing music stuff, and the music stuff is meant to also go to Twitch, because that's what I use to raid Colin when I'm done, so that I have something to watch myself. And I have my whiteboard, yay, and you might notice that I have a new sort of studio rig. The camera is sitting in a different place, and I was shuffling all kinds of things around this morning. It was real complicated. Mind you, that's the sort of thing that I do for fun. So there's that. So somewhat of a bigger view of my world than before. And I see folks in the chat. So what I've called this Q&A is rebuilds. Oh, here, let me clear this. Boop. Oh, I'm just talking to somebody in the Twitch chat, seeing as I'm kind of under false pretenses here. The Twitch is set for live modular synth, music and performing arts. You can see one, but unfortunately I don't have it going, and I don't know enough about Twitch to change the information on it. I would if I could. I don't know enough yet to be able to change the information on it, so let me. I'm fussing with everything. Consider this a derpy kind of stream in which I will do the best I can. And I see that I'm starting to get questions here, so if I have something that's important enough to focus on, I'll write it on the whiteboard so that we have some reference to that. And let me start trying to focus on questions while I'm at it. So, Lauda, hi, shout outs to Colin Benders, that's awesome. Especially since Ahmed is from the previous Airwindows crew. So, right on. Ahmed's asking, how is the compressor coming? What compressor? Now I'm confused. Multiple questions about the compressor. What compressor? I don't understand. There's also a question about low-level mixing. When you mix in low levels. Well, here's this is interesting. This is a very interesting question because you're missing a track here. Oh, David knows about Restream. I'm using Restream, yes, and I don't know anything about the Restream.io chatbot. So maybe we'll spend some time today trying to sort that stuff out. And anybody who's watching, if we do end up doing that, I'll write it on the whiteboard and we'll cover it in earnest so that other people who like to multi-stream can do that. But about this question about low-level mixing, what you are, Anand, Michelle, etc., that is a old studio trick for people mixing, and they do it on purpose. You do not necessarily want to... Oh, fair enough, okay. Yeah, I have made compressors. Bo is making a compressor. When that's finished, you can certainly bring it here, and we'll talk about that too. I'm more than happy to talk about folks' stuff that... Oh, and I'm also really distracted by all the little screens on my screen. Let me scooch these things around a little bit so that I'm somewhat less distracted by many little copies of Talking Chris all over the place. Gets a little ridiculous. So, low-level mixing. That is a known trick from folks who are professionally mixing. A classic trick is to drop the levels down so that you're in really, really, really low levels. And yeah, you mostly hear the 3K-ish range at low. You intentionally drop it right down, don't do anything to compensate, and listen for what's left. Like, what do you hear first when you start dropping it down till literally silence and then bringing it up? What shows up first? That's important. That is something that's worth knowing about. And that is a classic old trick. It's a trick like mixing, having your music playing and then like lying on the floor or putting your head against the wall or in the corner of the room or in an adjacent room in order to get different contexts on what the audio is doing. And yeah, like, honestly, I feel like if you're talking about doing low-level mixing and you're looking to do things like, first of all, you're probably using monitoring. I have a plugin that's especially for helping you with stuff in situations like that. So basically, the thing about that is if you're losing bass and listening at low levels, you are never going to be able to accurately position bass. But what you can do is turn on subs only on monitoring. And if you do that, then you will get a sort of microscope effect. You'll get a close-up of what the bass is doing. And when you do that, you can at least check what's happening there. It'll still be quiet, but you'll get a sense of what's happening in the incredibly low frequencies because you'll hear how it affects subs only. By the same token, you can turn on peak only, or peaks only, and when you do that, if something is mixed excessively loud, even if it's too quiet and you can't hear it, peaks only will make it distort and go crazy. And that too is a technique, it's a trick that you can use there. But it's a really important concept that if you are mixing over a very quiet level, nothing that you can do with like EQ is going to make you able to mix bass and sounds properly at that level. There is no way of actually doing it so that, oh, that compensated for me and then everything is fine. Instead, you'll have to do workarounds like mix check things like monitoring where it'll let you spotlight that stuff. Reverse Fletcher-Munson is useless for you. That is not going to help the situation. You'll never be able to balance things properly, especially if you're running the entire mix through a elaborate EQ thing. It's like trying to EQ your speakers to the room. Won't work. Not okay. Not going to happen. Trust me on that one. That is not something that you can do. Instead, you control your room. Instead, you control your situation, and then again, use monitoring for checking stuff that needs to get fixed. Because that's the real secret weapon there. Nothing's going to make you hear stuff as if it was good speakers in a real room at a normal volume. There's no way to compensate for that. There is no trick to substitute for that. But there are tricks like the ones in the monitoring plugin where, like in subs only, it can spotlight what's happening down there in a way that's impossible to miss. You're just not hearing in the context of everything else. Or slew only, that'll spotlight the highs in a way that is going to show you that, but it's not in the context of everything because listening to the full mix means listening to it in the full situation. And in a real room, like real speakers and all that kind of stuff, you can't work around that kind of thing. But what you can do is have extraneous means to check out stuff like the extreme deep bass that maybe your speakers don't handle. But if you throw on subs only, it no longer matters whether your speakers can handle it or not, because it'll be distorting and rumbling and making overdrive sounds, and you will hear what's happening regardless of whether you're hearing it the way you would if it was a real system. And same deal for peaks only, which is a deceptive. Peaks only is hard to understand, admittedly, but the thing with peaks only is that it can isolate things that are too noisy or too quiet. Stuff should still kind of sort of balance, even if you're using peaks only. It will wildly exaggerate anything that is out of balance, and that's important. And it'll do that regardless of what amplitude is being done. Like if you have bass that you normally can't hear, so you can't tell what it's doing. And yeah, subs only will show you that. But then if you flip on peaks only, that's also going to show you bass that you can't hear, because it'll suddenly be distorting everything. And that's the only thing that you can really do. So let me have a look at the, yeah. So there's a guy named Dan who uses an EQ on his monitoring chain. I don't agree. That's fine. We don't have to agree with everybody. I don't think that's sensible. So I don't agree with that move of his. Compressor, yes. And Foco, that's an interesting observation about low level being difficult, because it's like a spiral of ever going louder and louder. That's why people turn down and are just for a moment they're doing their mix or their mastering or whatever, and they're checking it out at this very quiet level, is because if your volumes just naturally creep, then you can get back to a very quiet level and sort of reference it. There's also another piece of advice around Slipperman, the noted metal guy Tim Gillies. He had a piece of advice in one of his MP3s that he did, a lot of years ago. And he was like, if you are doing an EQ move and you're taking something away, you're notching something out or you're dialing it back, and all of a sudden it sounds really bad, like, why did I do that? That was wrong. I made it sound worse. I should add things always and never take things away. What you do is you stop or you pause or you pull the volume down and have it playing very quietly for a bit, let your ears kind of adjust, and then put it back up again. Maybe it's going to seem fine all of a sudden. That's the thing, is, your ears do, and David just referred to exactly that. So what you do is you drop the levels, readjust your ears to that, bring them back up and see where you're at. Because that's the thing, is we work with ears even though they're completely deceptive. We work with this stuff even when it's not easy to work with, even when it's deceptive or complicated. And yeah. So, let's see now. David, my perforated eardrum is finally starting to slowly get better. Good, I'm glad to hear. So we're off to a rousing start talking about mixing and stuff. My Q&A title was on rebuilds. So I'm wondering whether people have thoughts of, because I've just done a fairly massive rebuild. You can see it looks and feels now like I have a lot more space than I did before. And part of that is because I'm less on top of the camera, which I can be again if I want, but I don't know, maybe I don't want. And part of it is because I rearranged, like I wouldn't have been able to put the camera there before because I had another screen much closer. And now I have like my keyboard here, and then there's a bunch of space to the screen that I'm reading you guys on. And yes, I am a mechanical keyboard fan. It is a DOS keyboard. It is, in fact, a DOS keyboard that I've typed on so much that the letters are wearing off. So there's that. And yeah, mechanical keyboard fan, no question. Also, I have a little adapter. This is what fooled me into thinking that my computer was dead, I think a couple of weeks ago, is I had it plugged into the input on a screen, or a slot in a screen, without the micro SD card in. And when I started up the computer, it apparently there's something in here other than just wires to connect to the other one, because it saw, oh, there's a USB thing. Let's wait and get all the USB stuff to load in order to check and see what we boot off of. And since there was no micro SD card in there, it couldn't boot. So there's that. But yeah, on the subject of rebuilding, sometimes I find, like, it's one of the things that I most usually like to do is rebuild and reshuffle stuff all the time. And the thing about it is, it's like reshaping the inside of your brain. There's stuff that you do where your mental model of how things work is also reflected in your surroundings. And I'm looking to kind of reboot where things sit and also reshape where everything's kind of rearranged. Like, I've rearranged my weekly schedule. I rearranged the screens. So I actually have a larger screen that is back there now, and that makes it feel like it's a larger but poorer screen, because I had another screen which was actually like a high DPI, but for that reason it was pretending to be basically just like HD. It was pretending to be 1920 by 1080, and I was a little cramped, but I was spending all my time on that, and it was also really close to my face, and everything felt kind of up front. Everything felt kind of in my face as a result of that. So now I am looking at screens that are farther away, and everything will seem a little bit more spaced out. And yeah, when I reconfigure the studio gear, when I reconfigure my stuff around here, it produces different effects as well. Like, I'm almost tempted to fire that up and show you what's going to happen on Tuesday, except for that, why should I spoil that? But I got the Euclidean circles thing, which is a new arrival, and found a trick that it does, which initially, and here's another thing about rebuilds and rethinking stuff. I got this because it was going to let me do Euclidean rhythms, which is possibly worth drawing on the whiteboard. This is, I bet you could get a plugin for this, although I don't make one. Not yet, anyhow. Here, let me... endlessly fooling with the mics and things. Yeah, this is my winter attire. The thing is that it is very cold in Vermont, so over the winter I'm wearing this very, very heavy bathrobe, and it keeps me from freezing because it is very freezing-esque. But yeah, Euclidean circles. Here's how that works. Let me see if I can, yeah. I'm trying not to yank my cables around too much. Maybe I can pull this out. Oh, it looks like I can. The continuation of this cable, it's a lavalier mic, and I had to plug it into this to make it work. Now I have all the room in the world. So, Euclidean circles. There is a circle. Now, what you do is you have a timing space and divide it up into sections. Euclidean circles is divided up into 16 sections, and the clock kind of goes around at a steady rate. Now, if you had one beat, the one beat will sit there. There's a control that lets you shift it, but let's pretend that it isn't there. If you had one beat, you'd place it on the one, right? So if you had two, you might place it 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But what if you start adding more? What if you have like a 3? If you place them evenly, you're either going to have an even division, or let's say we only have 4 beats. So we can only go at these points, but we have 3 rhythms to put in. What do? We'll go, let's divide this as evenly as we can. So you go 1, 2, space, 3. It's no longer evenly spaced, but it's still 3 in a 4-beat cycle. And that's what the Euclidean rhythm stuff is about. Now let's go beyond. Suppose we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And anybody, if chat can suggest a number to subdivide into that. I'm tempted to say 5. 5 or 3. Because if it's 3, you can do this, and then 3 would be a triangle effectively. So the 1 is going to be fine, but then you're going to have to decide between these beats or these beats for the other points on the triangle. So we might go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. And that's a Euclidean rhythm. That is a rhythm that is being generated by attempting to quantize, much like quantizing in digital audio, quantizing a shape or an equal division of things into a fixed number of slots. And you can only turn on or off these particular things. And you can also do, for instance, a pentagon. Let's make it a star, right? And what would we have here? Probably 1, 2, 1. So it's kind of similar. Dividing 5 into 8 is going to go like 1, 2, 3, 1. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2. Euclidean rhythm. So that's what I got. I got a modular thing that does that. And it does pretty flashy lights, which you'll be able to see on Tuesday and so on when I actually play with it. But that's the thing. And we don't actually, a sphere would be a 0. It has no points, no corners, therefore it would be total silence. So, yeah, that's the idea from that. Oh, and also, let's see for yourself. Pretty clicky. Definitely not silent. Definitely not a silent one. So that being my explanation of what Euclidean rhythms are, and these are things that Because essentially, the way that works, if you're just working in a DAW and using a step sequencer, and you've got like 16 steps in a loop that you can use, you can do Euclidean rhythms by hand. Euclidean rhythms are like the clave or whatever. They're widely known and accepted rhythmical pulses. It's just that they are as even as they can be, considering that they're dividing unusual things into an even series of steps. So what you can do is you can do Euclidean rhythms by hand, or there could be plugins and things. I would not be surprised if VCV Rack has something that'll do Euclidean rhythms. If not, somebody's going to come up with it because it's a very popular way of doing. Ricardo Benetti is bringing up something else. Your solder core stream got me excited again for doing some stuff with all CMOS chips and microcontrollers I have lying around. Yes, the idea for solder core, the whole solder core concept, is essentially I am going to try to make that stuff so that I can resell it to people at cost. And let me take this off for a moment. We're being really unprofessional with the mic anyway, so ditch the mic for a second. Why did Bloom go off camera, right? See, this is how serious I am about this project. I wonder if Twitch is ever going to notice me. Twitch is. I like the fact that I'm live streaming, and I like the fact that I can raid Colin when I'm done playing on Twitch, but I don't think I can move the whiteboard closer because there is no stand for it. It's leaning up against a keyboard. I can't make it be closer. But I have been getting stuff for the purpose of redistributing and making kits that people can fool with. And it looks kind of like this. Here's the pegboard you can work with. I can show how to work with this stuff. And you can put electronic components into the little holes in here. This is 10 pieces of pegboard. Costs like $70 to get as much of this. But the point being, I am actively working, and you can also just get them yourself using that. It's Mouser Electronics carries it. I figured out some stuff with this that pleases me very much because it means that I can go forward with it. Here, let me take a moment and same deal. Back in a second because I'm grabbing some stuff. That, which I can break. I'll get this entire case here. And let's see, what was the other thing? Oh, I remember. I had it tacked up on this. So the only thing I am missing is my pine boards. But I know it'll work. So yeah, you can get into this kind of building, and the problem always is like, okay, how do I put this in a case? What can I do to make this happen? What's going on? And you buy a case, and the case costs like $18 or something, or, you know, $18 to $200, $800 for a really big fancy case. It's a big ask to get into, especially when you can get into stuff and then find that like maybe that wasn't working so well for you. So it's important to be able to try something without automatically having it cost a world in order to get into it. So here's some things that I've been building from way back. Like this is a perf board that is in the size of a Eurorec panel. It's a 7 HP panel, which is an odd number, which is not, people don't like odd numbered Eurorec stuff, but it is because it fits a particular kind of jack that I got that I'm no longer that interested in working with. And this is a back panel which also fits that jack. You can put a bunch of these jacks in here and sandwich them together. Let me just keep running around getting stuff. It's rebuild time. Like, as long as I'm talking about it, you should see it. So yeah, you can take the little perf board things and make it into this. These are jacks that I got which are way larger than normal Eurorec stuff are. I got them because I was like, this looks like it'll be really reliable, which I'm sure is true. People just don't normally use a jack this large for, you know, plugs this tiny. And as you can see, I've soldered the backs together with wires. So this is a mult. This is a quad three-way mult. And technically there's ways of wiring it together so that they could be normaled or linking themselves together. It is a violin, I'm just not very good at it. Yes, that is a very cheap violin. And you can make larger panels. Like this is a panel that I made specifically for some purpose or other. I think it was the, I had an idea called the Psi Demon, which does similar things to what my Euclidean thing does. The Euclidean thing has a feature which I did not see the use of at first, and now I do, where it has a feature where you can have these three things controlling three different rhythms, and then there's three more jacks. Those could be a additional set of banks, like three more rhythms independently. But you can also tell it to be like offbeats. And I was like, that's not very useful. So one of, you know, every other beat goes to a different jack. That doesn't make any sense. And then it worked out like, oh, okay, that means every beat that is not being sent to the one thing automatically goes to the other one. And that means that is a trance bass generator. If you tell one of the rhythms to do like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's on 16ths, then the other jack is going to output the rests. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4. But then if you do something weird with the bass drum, you have the bass that's being triggered on those offbeats automatically compensating. So I played with that a little bit. I'll be doing some of that, I think, on Tuesday. And it is very much fun. But the idea behind this conglomeration of stuff, I believe this was for putting together Psi Demon, which is a set of switches and a sequential switch, a sequential chip and a set of switches where you could set everything to like 1, and then you'd have continuous rhythms going down like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Or you could flip them over to say 2 or something, in which case the switches that were set to 2 would be going to a different jack. And it would be possible to sort of manually create that effect. And then we have larger things like this. Again, this is still, actually, no, it is not, is it? That must be the back panel. Yeah, this is the jack panel. So it's it's not actually the Eurorack height, but the point being, you can make this stuff at a height that you could screw into a Eurorack system and drill holes in just the right place, put the screws in. Don't put them in too tightly, because if you crack this, then there's no fixing it. But you can mount this stuff into a system and start building things out of just perf board and wires and chips. And wires cheap, and this stuff is not cheap, but you get a lot of it. Like $8 or so gets this. And especially if you get it in bulk, like I'm doing, you can get it at a somewhat discounted price, and that's a lot of space. If you were to get a Eurorack aluminum panel to do it properly, this size, and have it machined and painted and whatever properly, it would start costing a ridiculous amount of money. Doing that stuff is really expensive, which is why Eurorack modules are so expensive. But a piece like this might be just like, I don't know, less than $1. And individual chips might be like 39 cents. The jacks are a little more expensive. So what does one do? Well, just so happens that if you are building something like this, you could just put simple thumbtack through these holes. It's exactly the right size. And like thumbtack it onto a piece of wood, like a pine board. You don't even have to drill the holes to start off with that would let you put it into a Eurorack case. You could simply go here. Boop. And this is the innovation that I got excited about and what I'm going to be running with. You can start building things with chips and perf board and wire. I'm going to have to figure out good ways of getting power to this stuff, because you ideally want to be able to eventually convert over to Eurorack power if you want to bring all of your stuff over into a real case. Real cases are expensive. Getting like a briefcase, this is my secret briefcase concept, getting a briefcase from Goodwill or something like that, of whatever, or lunchbox, I don't care. Making it have slots of this size and using, like pine boards of the appropriate, you'd space them correctly. You'd space them so that the stuff that you built would work. And then you just slide this down into there, connect the power, and stick a thumbtack on, thumbtack it into the board. Now you have a solidly built thing for virtually nothing. Virtually nothing. And this is a concept that's exciting me and something that I'm going to be pursuing, because until I worked out a number of things, really. There is a here. I'm running around all day. Let's see what else we can get. Let's see what other toys we can do. Don't mind me grabbing a wire stripper. Some more pieces of perf board. And the jacks. And these things. All right. But wait, there's more. So here's the deal. If you're building things like this, then yeah, so you can get perf board. That's fine. You can drill holes in it or get some kind of little auger and widen holes out or whatever. I needed to use a drill press to make some of these holes, but if you're just thumbtacking stuff to pine board, you don't need these particular ones. And do you need these jacks? Maybe not, because if you get this particular kind of IC socket, and it's possible to get, and sometimes it's possible to get in surplus, it doesn't really matter the number of pins, because you can actually break this stuff apart, making it a single inline pair, make it shorter, longer. I have a selection of single inline pair here, and a little stack of the 8-pin. And some of these I just kind of had, and other ones I built in one way or another. And then I also have this showed up on my Instagram at one point, individual pin jacks. Broken out of some of these things. And as you can see, I still have lots more where that came from. Lots of just individual pin things. What's the purpose of that? Well, a jack might cost you a couple bucks if you have a really good one. But this, pennies. And then if you put it into the perf board, you can use little tiny jumper cables. You have a jack and you have a cable for next to nothing. Now when I say next to nothing, and it doesn't want to pull out because I haven't soldered it to the other side, but these are designed to work on this size. It has to be exactly 22 gauge. That's the size of these little jumper cables. And it's actually a better connection than the Bastel synths, because the Bastel synths aren't using this kind of fancy jack. This is a these are jacks that are sort of machined and have fancy little connections inside them. They're micro miniaturized, but they're designed to do multiple connections and actually carry quite a lot of amperage. This stuff will wind up sounding kind of like, oh God, what's the West Coast synth guy? The Banana Jack synths. Buchla. Do this up properly and it'll start sounding kind of Buchla-ish, because these might be incredibly flimsy looking, but you know, you can run amperes through these connections and they'll be quite happy with it. They're just cumbersome to work with because they're so small. They're not going to sound bad. Arguably, Eurorack connections will sound worse and have worse connections than this stuff. And one additional point to make about, you can get these little jumper cables that have the little plastic dinguses, and you know, you plug into the connections on these, but all electronics sells wire from Consolidated Electronic Wire and Cable that is solid core. It's like hookup wire. I believe it is steel. I'm using it for lots of permanent connections or semi-permanent connections on the Eurorack thing. I'm making little, like soldering it to plugs. But you can get spools of this for very cheaply, and check it out. It is 22 gauge, so so you don't even have to get these jumper cables. You could do the entire thing with the random little CMOS chips that are like 39 cents. And these jack sockets, if you can get those from somewhere, or find them surplus or whatever. And the perf board stuff, which is a little more expensive, but not all that much. And you can wire stuff up on that They call it dead bug prototyping. And simple solid core wire from a company that'll sell you 22 gauge solid core wire. And this becomes your patch cords. This becomes your jacks. What you do about potentiometers and things is another story. But this can also become your switches. Wire stuff up to different things and then plug and unplug the cables to do your switching. It's, again, cumbersome, but it would work. And all of this makes it possible to do like full-on mad scientist synth building for way, 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 way cheaper than people are normally able to do. And that's something that excites me a lot. And so that is actually among my Patreon goals. I don't know how much I've talked about this, but I do have a Patreon goal, which I think is still present and sitting there. At the point that I hit like $2,000 a month, which is we're not wildly far away from that, but it's okay if it's not happening right now. It's okay if this takes a while to happen, because I think I have to demonstrate some of this stuff first. At the point that I clear $2,000 a month, I will start reselling this stuff to people as they want it at cost. At cost. No profit. And I will be buying it. Let me see. Stuff is all over the place here. I'll be buying it in bulk quantities. Like I'll come up with a way of getting a really large spool of this cable, and I'll be buying the large orders of these, and then I will be selling it in much smaller increments at the price I paid. And the limit on a monthly basis will be how much I clear $2,000 to do it, which answers the question of, you can't do that. You'll go out of business. How can you not make a profit doing this, you silly fool? That's un-American. How can you? The answer there is like, I'm going to do it to the extent that the Patreon is. If people get frustrated because I'm sold out for a month and not going to keep going until the next month, they can make the Patreon be higher, and that'll raise the threshold. It'll raise the amount that I'm willing to do. If it became, because there's no restrictions here. It's not like you can't go into business doing this. It's like, go ahead and go into business doing stuff built off of the things I'm buying in quantity and then reselling in smaller amounts at the same price. You go ahead and make businesses out of that. It's just that you won't necessarily be able to get those supplies directly from me all the time, because I might sell out for the month. And I might be serving people who are like newer DIYers, newer experiments for the month. That part is entirely up to me. So if people want me to throw more money towards this, they can throw more money at me. And it's not like I'm losing anything, because I'll be selling at cost. So that is a longer range plan. That is something that I'm going to be doing, because it's been on my mind for some time, and I feel like it's really exciting. Like, you wouldn't believe the chips that I've got. I have so many cool chips. It is unreal. I've got like binary and decade counters. I've got a thing where you put a clock into it, and it switches between different pins on the output as the clock goes. Like, it'll go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Not 11 though, it'll go up to 10. And that combined with other chips like it, and it's like you barely even need any extraneous parts. I'll be working on how simple I can make this stuff, because at a 39-cent chip you don't have to worry about whether you break it. But that is a sequencer right there. If you patch it to potentiometers, you have a built-in sequencer. If you patch it to switches or banks of connections, then you have other things that can go along with the sequencer. There is another one, another chip that is a pulse lengthener. If you hook it up to the right parts, the right resistors and things, then that one can take your input click and delay it. It's a swing generator, but you can also lengthen the output of the pulse, meaning that it's an envelope generator. It just happens to be a straight up gate. And there's like hex inverters that work as sort of tube sound fuzz things. I also have a wide collection of transistors. I've been getting like 100 transistors here and 100 transistors there. And I've identified the transistors, which is not actually hard because you can look this up fairly easily, that Devi ever made circuits of. So some of my fancy boutique stuff, like my Helios, for instance, that does one of my key guitar pedals. And that is one very simple circuit with this one transistor and another very simple circuit with another transistor. These are not complicated. They're not like rocket science. What they are is a matter of taste, a matter of choice, and a matter of soldering stuff together and trying it out. And you could use things like the Helios is a silver crank and a dark energy in one box. It's actually the same thing as a Hyperion, which is a very popular pedal, which is kind of like the Uber Big Muff. And the dark energy is basically just a FET with some capacitors and a very high input impedance and an unusual way of rolling off. And the way that it's wired up, it's basically like a Mondo Mega Bass Boost. You can use that in synthesizer purposes just as easily. Like, these things don't have to be very complicated. You can get amazing things happening out of just wiring stuff together. I've done that basically all my life, starting with Craig Anderton's electronic projects for musicians, which is great. So I do believe I'm going to be able to get people doing this. Let me have a look at my chat and scroll back while we're talking, because there's a lot of, I always like it when people talk a lot, but sometimes they need me to talk as well. So Riccardo Benetti is saying tidal cycles is good for experimenting with Euclidean rhythms. Fair enough. I'll make a note of that, yeah. Sebastian did have a question, and he is absolutely correct, saying 96K. I recommend 96K. I feel like doing the digital processing stuff, when you invariably get some aliasing and things, but then 96K is not so high that you're just throwing lots of samples around willy-nilly, but it's high enough that it gives you some buffer zone. And in terms of just directly capturing and playing back, 2496 is basically good enough for musical enjoyment purposes and for most people to be satisfied with it if you do it right. Like, if you're not trying to hype incredibly massive, powerful supersonic sounds or failing to dither to 24-bit or whatever, then 2496 will remain adequate and to pretty much any listener. We're talking even the fancy pants listeners who can generally hear things like 24-bit dithering. So dither and do this stuff right, and then you're basically fine. And I am doing my recording and stuff at 96K. The things that you hear from me and the things that are getting streamed, they're going into the computer at 96K. And when I put SoundCloud up, The SoundCloud is $24.96, and it is raw capture off of the converter, which is as close as I can get to, like, one of the things I was considering the other day was getting some Nakamichi Dragons and producing a, like, 3A all analog form of being able to buy the music that I do. Because it'd be real restrictive, but if I had the right tape cassettes, I could come up with outputting the output from my analog mixer and a whole series of largely analog instruments and things, and my analog guitar with the analog amp and then the microphone and so on and so forth. Basically, until I capture the music rig that I use on a tri-weekly basis, 3 times a week basis, is all analog, other than some things like reverbs and stuff, which I can get away with. But the summing and a lot of the tone sources and a lot of that stuff, that's just how I roll. I'm not really interested in going full DAW. And it's another reason why I'm trying to get people into this sort of hacker homebrewy kind of stuff. It's because that's all analog as well. And I just feel there's a lot. It just works really well for me. I just like it a lot. And if I was recording to like a Nakamichi Dragon cassette tape, in theory, I'd be able to, like, first of all, play that into the computer, and then I'd have something that I could throw on SoundCloud or whatever. But if somebody was really excited about getting an all analog Airwindows jam, I'd have like one copy of the cassette tape. And there are people who are very into listening to cassette tapes these days, so that's funny. But it would be even funnier if it was like, oh, hey, guess what? It's 2020, and I can do a entirely analog release without having to get a record pressed or anything like that. Oh, one catch. It's a cassette tape, and there's only one of them. That would be funny as anything. I don't think that's going to happen. That's not going to be a priority, because it's like too silly, and it's also kind of annoying. And that I could do it, but it would be like, okay, who among my fans is A, insanely wealthy, and B, wants to get these things as like collectibles or whatever? It wouldn't end up getting listened to. I think if you like won an auction and fought other people to get the Airwindows cassette tape that's the master tape of this particular thing, you wouldn't necessarily want to sit around listening to it. It would wear out. So, but it's a funny thought. Like, if anybody else who is musicking out there is interested in running with that idea, it fulfills several purposes. It fulfills the purpose of producing a object of desire and value, in that, like, people say a Nakamichi Dragon on the correct tape cassette, and I think that this is fairly plausible, gets damn near the quality of open reel tape. And you know, if I captured the output of my music to open reel tape, it would be freaking amazing. Like, I am still losing something a tiny bit, even going to 2496. Or rather, I think when I go to 2496, I'm effectively communicating what you'd be able to get out of a purely analog mix. It has that tone to it. That's what I do. And rather than just doing plugins that have the analog tone, it's like, yeah, I've spent some time building a studio system that I use on a regular basis that is literally an analog studio and producing an analog tone, and I'm capturing it as cleanly as I possibly can with a very nice converter, it's a Lavry. And I think it gives a pretty good example of what you'd get out of a, like, if I was to do a direct-to-disc, if I was to get a vinyl cutting lathe, and then I'd be doing all of my crazy instrument stuff very delicately so I didn't joggle the cutting lathe as it busily tried to cut a vinyl record. I think they're very noisy as well, but I wouldn't have any mics open. And I'd be able to do a all analog to vinyl record master. And the setup that I put together would perform pretty well in that context. I think it would really show off what you're able to get out of these all analog chains. But that's really cumbersome. And although getting a fancy tape deck, or indeed any tape deck, and recording, I would also be interested in getting something that's like, okay, there's a 16-bin cassette recorder. So we will make a cassette master, but we're going to record 16 of them at once. Therefore, you have 16 copies of this rather than just the one. That'd be kind of cool, but at the moment, I don't feel that's really going anywhere. So yeah, as far as the chat is concerned, we're still talking about the Craig Anderton stuff. And Bo was asking about what the Patreon level was, which I think got me started on that. And yeah, Patreon's fine. It's still in that thing where it's like, if you need to take care of yourself, then bail off of it. I'm not going to be hurt by that. Like, it might slow down some of these grand ambitions of making grand projects going on, but that's fine. It's like my needs are met. So yeah, Patreon is by design kind of steady. Anybody who's interested in that kind of stuff and is down with using them, because it's kind of like, you know, depending heavily on PayPal or something. It is a crowdsourcing kind of thing. If you build it up to the point where it is a livable monthly income, it's not common that it wildly changes month by month, which is very different from operating in a commercial basis where you're dependent upon hyping your next product to the moon in order to try to get a really good month, and you're living constantly in fear of having a couple of lame products in a row and going out of business. Patreon, or anything like it, is a very suitable thing for just engaging with a wide range of people who are willing to toss you $1 or so a month, or however much that they consider is reasonable, or however much you can give them something that makes it reasonable for what they're offering. And the whole thing about it is that it's probably going to grow if you're continuing to work and do good stuff. Probably it will grow, but it's also very steady. By definition, Patreon income acts steady, whether it's small or large or whatever. It doesn't really jump around wildly month by month. So that is, you know, my advice to people who are interested in doing stuff and living, I guess, is lean on stuff like that. Because if you're going to go full commercial, you're gambling on making products or music releases or whatever in which this one was amazing, this one was really exciting, and everybody wanted it until they started pirating it or whatever. And then the next month, what are you going to do? It forces you to make all of these choices that are all about keeping the hype up. And that's happened to a lot of plugin manufacturers. As we know, we've seen it. We know how that works. So yeah, Bo is referring to the, Anand has a quick question. Pocket Verb, only a plugin that is CPU heavy. Is there any way to make it lighter? No. Mind you, I can make bits of it lighter, which I never actually got around to doing, by redesigning it and having the individual pieces of it broken out into separate plugins. That would do something towards making it a little bit lighter. But it would still hit the CPU fairly hard, because the way that's working is that's a big old pile of all passes and delays and things. It's a reverb. And it's not really a super cleverly designed reverb. Instead, it's a reverb that's running like with Airwindows grade word length, and keeping really deep. Well, although granted, I don't always have to do that. There are things that you can learn, like the MIDI verbs. I've been still getting MIDI verbs. At some point, I'm going to make a video which is demonstrating what it sounds like with increasing numbers of series MIDI verbs. So it's like this is the sound of MIDI verbs program 50. Program 50 is the deep outer space thing. Like, I think Colin Benders would like that one because he likes the same depth of reverb as I do. And this is one MIDI verb with setting 50. And this is one MIDI verb into the other MIDI verb, both of them on setting 50. And then here's 3 MIDI verbs, all set to setting 50, all in series. The one goes into the other, goes into the other. And you just keep stacking them up. At this point, I think I can take it to 5. Although some of them are a little sketchy, like one of the ones that I got, the LED readout for what you've selected is broken. I think another one was all scratchy and not really working. I was getting them whether or not they were said to be really clean and nice. But I am getting to where I can run a whole bunch of MIDI verbs into each other in series, and that's what I'm doing for my super deep ambient stuff, with one caveat. For my super deep ambient stuff, I have a aux running into one side of a MIDI verb because it's full wet, so the left and right no longer matter. It only matters if you're mixing some dry in. And then the other MIDI verb, its output is going into the input of the other channel. And then I'm going into one of the inputs of that, but the unused output from the one that's a little deeper into it is feeding into its input. And for some patches that works real good, other ones not so much. And currently I'm running it through a capacitor arrangement, which is bleeding off the highs a little bit and darkening it a little bit and cutting bass out a little bit, but you can just patch them. You can patch it direct and it won't quite feed back. Or at least I think in most of them won't. So that's also part of my infinite reverb concept, is that the one that's like one series level down is also doing some self-feedback, and the one on the end can't because it's running stereo. But the one that's a level deeper, I'm using one input on it, and I'm using only one of its outputs to feed the main one. So that does give me the option to patch it for self-feedback to some extent. So let's see, it's 12:16, so we got about half an hour or so, roughly, a little bit less than half an hour. People are talking in the chat about like Anderton's, and yeah, Craig Anderton's different fella, but the Electronic Tinkerer wrote a famous book, Electronic Projects for Musicians, and that is a killer book to get a hold of. Many, many valuable things in there. And stuff that's difficult. For instance, there's a phase shifter. The phase shifter is a very demanding project. I don't think I even have a copy of this book anymore. I should get one again. It'd be hard to get, expensive at this point, out of print. But the phase shifter requires what he calls CLM 6000s. But that's a Vactrol. A Vactrol is nothing but a LED connected to a cadmium sulfide photocell. You can build those yourself. It might be a little tricky, but that's kind of the thing, is if you start getting into this stuff, you're going to need to learn to build some of those things. So not being able to source the Vactrol that he used in the phase shifter thing stops being as much of an issue, because you're thinking in terms of like, well, how can I work around it to work with this one that I just made myself? Or what kind of CDS cells can I use? I'll buy a bunch of different kinds and fool around with them and start seeing, you know, if the LED is too bright, what can I do to mellow that out while adding resistors and stuff? If the LED flashes on and off too fast, which is actually not a thing, but because they all flash on and off fast, what can I build as far as resistors and capacitors and things to smooth it a little bit, slow down the reaction, which is also part of how the Vactrols that are hard to get are typically the ones where the photocell responds really slowly. Like you ping it with light and then it takes a long time for the resistance to change back down. Well, you can fake that by having having the LED not shut off instantly. Instead, you have a capacitor in there so the LED flashes and then it'll slowly dim down because there's a capacitor still feeding energy through it. Probably would have to be a fairly large one, but if it slowly pings down like that, it's going to act like the hard-to-find CDS cells. It's going to act like the Vactrols that are less easy to get a hold of. So you can work around these things. So let's see now. So Craig Anderson, yes. Bo says that there is a plugin called Reverb. That's cool. I was going to start talking about the Reverb a little bit too. There are several interesting things about Reverb, the one that I've got at least. I have a Reverb too, I just haven't done much or anything with it. It's a rack mountable one, it's more convenient to work with in many ways, but the original one that only has RCA jacks is the one that won my heart. And the deal with that is 1 and 2, the rack mountable one and the RCA jack one, both have primitive processing that didn't have multiplies. So all of the gain changing operations had to be done with bit shifts. Oh, what the hell? Let's make YouTube think that I'm a bad person. Bit shifts. And I've got a plugin called Bit Shift Gain that is the cleanest way of doing a gain change because it will not really quantize anything. Instead, it's just changing the exponent while leaving the mantissa untouched. So in the MIDI verbs, and I think you can see where I'm going with this, there's like all passes and things where you're supposed to do a multiply by 0.618. And there's correct ways of doing this. And there's bloom effects that use all passes. But since the MIDI verb does not have a multiply function in its computer, it is taking in audio, and every single thing that it does within itself is effectively being done with the Airwindows plugin Bit Shift Gain. What that means is your reverb tails maintain a tonal quality, and all of the algorithms in there, which were expanded upon greatly when they got into MIDI Verb 3, MIDI Verb 4, and so on. They immediately went to like higher sample rates. What can we do to make higher sample rates? We need more high frequencies. We need the multiplies. We need to do these things correctly. And they did all of that, and something of value was lost because reverb doesn't have lots of sparkly, glittery highs. Once sound is bounced around for a few seconds, the highs have all worn off of it. You got to design that in order to have stuff working properly. And MIDI verb, by default, the sampling rate for the first one, which is the difference between MIDI verb 1 and 2. MIDI verb 1, very poor sampling rate. Not even close to like CD quality or whatever. And of course, back in the day, they were like, everything is about CD quality. This must be great. Therefore, we're really losing out if we don't have CD quality. And they did not understand that what they had was a hardware reverb device that in analog built in a band limited quality that caused stuff to sound like it was far away. And reverb is supposed to sound like it's far away. So MIDI Verb 2, they lost a little bit of that because they managed to goose the sampling rate a little bit. They made it a little brighter. And then 3 and 4 and so on, they not only had that, but they had calculations where instead of doing a bit shift for the multiply, they did a real multiply and caused quantization in the process of doing it every step of the way. So yeah. And this is all stuff that could be done again. Like, there's no reason somebody has put out a coffee's cold, doesn't matter. Somebody has put out a delay chip, actually from probably back in the 90s. I don't know how long this has been about, but PT2399 is a basically a slapback delay that is it's running on a DSD-like technology, SACD-like technology, but at a much lower quality. It is working as like a delta segment encoder and decoder. And you can get these chips for like less than $1. Like, you could buy 10 of them for very cheaply. And I have done so. And I have a bunch of these chips. I haven't done anything with them, but that's what all this stuff is for. So when I build the final synthesizers and things, what it's going to be is stuff like, okay, here's my module for the delay chip. Put the delay chip, come up with whatever power supply thing I can do that is still as cheap as everything else, and figure out what minimal like capacitors and like resistors and things I need to do. Put the delay chip on, put the IC sockets in for inputs and outputs. Oh, somebody has made, you can get these now. This is one of the things I'm trying to bring awareness, is how much you can actually do at this stage. Because like everything that's in these expensive fancy synthesizers can be done with like 39-cent IC chips. Or at the most, like if you wanted to get a really good sound generator, like the same VCO chip that you'd get out of like some of the old Moogs and things. Not all the old Moogs, because a lot of those were just like hardwired transistors, but some of the old Moog, some of the old Roland, stuff like that, used a chip, especially when they started getting into polyphonic. You can get those chips for like what, $4 to $7? And then you have a signal source. Then you have an analog signal source. You can get filter chips much the same way. And those, again, like $4 to $7. You can get noise generating chips that make bursts of white noise for you. Again, $2 to $5. All of this is available. So you can have like, okay, here's my drums, here's my synths, here's my VCOs, here's some, oh look, some VCAs, voltage controlled amplifiers, and so on. And wire them up all in little pieces of epoxy board like this, and patch them all together with wires and those pin jacks if you want the connections to be, less than soldered and permanent, if you want to be able to actually patch this stuff. And it can all be put together at dirt cheap if you do it right. If you don't need to get like rail jacks and plugs and cables for things, this is my vision with that stuff, is it's possible to get it going on. And Darwin Dees has a stereo question, because I see a question in Twitch and in YouTube. Probably a good idea to jump over to the YouTube so that I saw it, because I spotted it there first. Where do you put console plugins when you're doing parallel processing, using a fake master bus instead of stereo out? That's an interesting question. I'm not really quite sure what the answer is, because I'm not really quite sure what parallel processing is. If you are doing a set of channels and they're going to entirely separate recordings that are not going to be summed. Like if you are going to be, if your parallel processing means you have multiple outputs that are going to be handled distinctly, then you would run things to each separate output, and each separate output would have a console bus on it, and gain between the channel and bus is still going to be unity gain. So let's see. But I still see that your question at the top of the thing there, Bo, is how come analog tape has such smooth high end? Let's whip out the paw of erasure and the dry erase marker again for our last 10 or so minutes. We can talk about that a little bit. As far as plugins with the base hitting qualities of character, no, I'm not going to do that because I have plenty of EQs already. Anyways, here is how analog tape works and what's happening with the high end that I'm modeling with a bunch of different stuff. You got your tape, right? And you have to record a waveform onto the tape. But in order to shift the magnetic particles of the tape, you need to move it a certain amount before anything will happen. So if you try to do this, and you just go directly to a tape, you're going to get a grungy sound because it's not going to try to react to this subtlety until it goes past a certain point and is able to actually start moving stuff. Or when you're actually having a big waveform, then you're going to get a big output. But the little subtle stuff is not going to move the tape. The tape is full of all of these little magnetic particles. In order for anything to happen, you got to move the particles. You got to change the magnetism of the particles. And it takes a certain amount of energy going into it to do that. They don't just subtly move tiny amounts because you hinted at them. You have to poke them in order to get them to settle properly. So what we have is bias. This is why they say high bias, low bias, stuff like that. And bias is a high frequency waveform that keeps the flux sort of modulating. It keeps poking the tape, and then you've also got this lower frequency stuff going on it, which is the output waveform that you want. So normal bias means this is just iron oxide tape. It's boring. There's nothing fancy about it. And a small amount of high frequency wiggle will get the tape particles wiggling around, and then when you pass past it, you're leaving pretty much the larger waveform on there. You can pull some of the bias frequency off the tape, and this is one way that people do sort of deflutter of tape, is capture it at a really high quality, try to find the bias in the waveform, and then make the bias be a perfectly stable pitch because it was generated by some kind of oscillator. It's not going to fluctuate at all. High bias tape is a different magnetic formulation. It's no longer just ordinary flecks of rust. Instead, you've got like chromium in there or something. You've got other formulations, and that gives you smaller magnetic particles. It gives you more ability to reproduce high frequencies in there, but it's harder to move. So when you go high bias, what you need is a larger waveform on there. And so high bias tape needs a bigger oscillation to make this stuff work. And if your bias is not large enough, then you get a slightly grungy quality out of the tape because it's failing to capture all the subtleties of the motion. Now here's where it gets interesting. Tape has limitations on how much amplitude you can put onto it. You can only magnetize it so much, or demagnetize it so much. Now, if we just have a waveform, that's one thing. But what if we have like a high bias tape, and we've also got to pretend that that is perfectly even. We've also got to record that in order to make it work. Well, guess what? We overlay that on top of this. We can't modulate that any farther. So the thing that we have to send to the tape is the waveform that we want plus whatever modulation of the bias, no matter how high that is. If we've overmodulated the tape, then we're going to round off that point on the high frequency there. We're also going to saturate lows the same way, but this is what's happening to the highs to some extent, is you've got the bias signal that is making the tape move. And then you've got your waveform. But high frequency sounds are often these little sharp spikes. And if that little sharp spike combined with the bias goes too loud, and remember high bias or chrome is a larger signal. Normal bias, smaller. High bias is high because it has to be a larger signal. It could be like practically as large as the whole waveform. And the bigger that is, the more it combines and limits how much of a high you're able to push through it. And again, you can always restrict that by just not hitting the tape as hard. But if you don't hit the tape as hard, you start getting noise. And that's basically a large part of how that works. And a similar feature, a thing that works kind of the same way, is present in my 2-tape and tape plugins, and also in acceleration. It does a similar thing like that. And no, all tape has always had to use bias. In order to record on tape at all, you got to have bias. So it's not like they started using bias, but you started using high bias when people came up with formulations that required them. Come up with a magnetic tape formulation where the chunks of iron oxide in there are much more finely grained, and they're a different metal, and like a chrome tape. Like, oh, finely grained, better high frequencies at a given speed, because the size of the chunk and how fast it's moving past determines how fine of a detail you can have. And so machines started using high bias, and machines started using chrome and stuff like that. And that is why analog tape has such smooth high end. The bias is rounding it off. Now, yeah. And you see, I can't do, if I could do slew for things like bass, I would. It's not a thing. So, yeah, sometimes questions are not formulated in ways that I can make a plugin to do them. But I can keep trying to think up new stuff. If I can ever come up with something that is as good as slew only or slew limiting on bass, I totally will. But at this time, that's not a thing. Darwindy's asking about aux that get compressed and then mixed with the dry. I would leave all that stuff sitting inside the console process. So I would not be decoding it and then compressing it really hard and then bringing it back in, I would just leave all of that stuff inside, and having the most of it, the what you'd call the dry of your parallel compression, that remains unity gain. Then whatever you're doing as far as like more compression to bring stuff up a little bit, you're doing that on the pre-distorted signal, but that's probably fine. And it'll change the... You won't get exactly the same effect, but it'll probably be as good or better to do it that way. And Vinyl Takeshi, I'm old. I grew up when tape was a thing. That's how I know about that stuff. I'm over 50 years old. So when I was your age, you kids these days, you didn't necessarily have to know this, but this was all there was. This was the thing. It was like you learned normal tape or high bias tape. If you bought normal tape and you ran it in a high bias machine, then it would sound a little wonky and you'd have to figure it out. If you bought chrome tape by mistake and you have a normal biased recorder, your recording is all messed up or it didn't even capture at all. And you'd lose your entire jam because you tried to record on a tape and it was the wrong tape. You had to learn this stuff. Much like these days, you kind of have to learn, or if you know what's good for you, you have to learn stuff like dithering and aliasing and such. And Garrett, this is my normal indoor house outfit for winter. So I'll be working on, like, when it starts getting really hot, which it hasn't really, obviously it hasn't started getting hot. But you know, I like chilling out and being comfortable for the Monday Q&A stream, because why act too serious? For the Sunday stuff, I have my nice pretty white shirt. I might be wearing like pajama pants under it, but I have my nice pretty white shirt, and I'm presenting a very slick appearance, because introducing plugins, who knows who might be watching those. And on the music streams, I've increasingly been just decked out in sort of black Antifa garb or something. I suppose I'd have to wear a mask for that, but I've been wearing this like black long sleeve shirt and black jeans, and I'm toying with the idea of getting white pants and then wearing the white Sunday Airwindows Niceness shirt, and because I have the flashing lights and it would show up under the lights better. But it's like, if you're going to be making videos, you might as well be fooling with all that kind of stuff. Like, check out ContraPoints sometime. ContraPoints is a, like, trans activist, editorialist, comedian, politician type person. You don't necessarily have to agree with everything that she has to say, but that is somebody who has a lot of fun with costuming and lighting. And always did. Like, from way back, this is somebody who was like, I'm going to buy some light fixtures and then put red over here and green over here, and it's going to look crazy. And, wearing clothes for doing streams is part of that. Just run with it. Have fun with it. Anand is asking, what is next week's plug? I don't know yet. Releasing Elation ran me out of my backlog, where I no longer have one. It'll depend upon what comes to mind. Like, I don't know what the plug is going to be next week. I do feel I'm going to have one, because I like to not throw in too many things like chord organ firmware or whatever in a row. Like, I do have a video game that I could put out. I needed to fuss with it a little bit in order to, ironically, this video game doesn't have sound. So I kind of need to come up with sound for this video game. But when I do that, then I can put that out, and that'll probably be another weekend thing, but I wouldn't be putting it out right away, because I don't want to go too long without an audio plugin that people can use. So I honestly don't know. There are a number of possibilities, and there's kind of like, I couldn't tell you. It's going to be one of these ideas I've been tossing around, and I'm pretty sure I'm not up to doing fancy things like stuff that I have yet to figure out how to do it, like the sorting stuff into a sine wave like shape. I'm no sorry I ever talked about that one, because it's like I still don't know how to do it, and it could be months before I see my brother again, if ever, and that one may never happen, but something will. I'll come up with something. So that says 1:42, and that says 12:43, and I started at 11. So this has been an hour and 42 minutes plus of live streaming, and I'll catch up with my other stuff that I'm doing today. With that, I will, I think, close the Twitch window, and cheers to the one person who is in Twitch. And I will bid the YouTube chat goodbye, like so. And it's been fun. I admit that this hasn't been a very directed one, but on the other hand, we did talk about how audio tape has that smoother high end. That's why. That, and the fact that tape heads are transformers. That's very important too. The fact that tape heads are transformers with like a core is very important, because that means that they operate like transformer circuits do. But yeah, it's been fun. And I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.